They'd heard a lot about these places called Detroit and Chicago. Figured if they could find land halfway in between and make it into a popular city, they could make a lot of money. They were land speculators. No lumber barons here. We were a lot of swampland. The Ketchum brothers came out. Sidney Ketchum rode out from Ann Arbor in 1830 on horseback, and he found a spot where two rivers come together. You're between them now. The main ones being Rice Creek on this side of our little hill, and over here will be the Kalamazoo River. He bought the land and went back to New York to get his brother George. While he was there, he talked it up. He said, Marshall is the place you need to be. They named us Marshal after Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, a very well-known man who became our longest-running Supreme Court Justice to date. And he really set our judicial system as we know it. To give you an idea of how well-respected he was still alive when they named us Marshal. The Ketchum brothers came out in 1831 and built the first log cabin. 6 years later, Michigan was declared a state. And Marshall was one of the larger cities outside of Detroit. Okay, in all honesty, it didn't take much to be a large city outside of Detroit in 1831. However, by the time the population of Marshall hit 1,000, the overwhelming majority were doctors, lawyers, politicians, educators, and ministers. So they had political clout. Those Ketchum brothers, the land speculators, they were doing pretty good. In 1835, James Wright Gordon came to town. He came from Connecticut by way of New York, where he had been working at a college. He came here, he loved it so much, made a little bit of money in land speculation himself. He convinced the rest of his family to come. When Michigan was declared a state, in 1837, they put that capital temporarily in Detroit. Well, they knew they couldn't leave it there. Can't trust those wily Frenchmen. But they gave themselves 10 years to decide where that capital was going to be. Marshall didn't need 10 years. We knew it was going to be right here. Indeed, the city was so confident, the city set aside the grounds across from us here to be Capitol Hill, and we are just pretentious enough to call it Capitol Hill to this day. Now, James Wright Gordon, as I said, was here in 35, but by 39, he had already been a state representative and a state senator. And in 1839, he was so confident that not only was Marshall going to be the capital, but he was going to be governor. That he had this governor's mansion built high atop Capitol Hill. Now, bear in mind, there's no radio, no TV, so if you're marketing yourself as running for governor, building a governor's mansion, not a bad way to do it. Indeed, the Doric columns out front, they were brought by oxen from Detroit. I always imagine this, you know, we had trees here, but they were brought by slow, plodding oxen going through virtually every town between Detroit and Marshall, saying, therefore, the governor's mansion. It makes sense. The Whig, he was considered a shoo-in. The Whig convention was even being held right here in Marshall that year. However, in their early vote, what would we now call primary, he came in second. That put him on the ballot as lieutenant governor, with Woodbridge running for governor. In the fall election, they won. So Woodbridge became Michigan's second governor. However, the very next year he ran for and won the U.S. Senate seat. So in 1841, James Wright Gordon from Marshall, Michigan, the lieutenant governor, became Michigan's third governor. Now, it was only for 1 year, because the terms at that time were only for 2, and, well, he came in halfway through. But we think it was a pretty distinctive year. You see, he was the first Michigan governor to pardon a convicted slave. I have no proof that he was a true abolitionist, but we know he worked with quite a few of them. And we also know that he was a defense attorney or an attorney for many different slave cases across this entire region of Michigan. And so was his law partner. After his stint as governor, he came back here to Marshall because the capital was still in Detroit. And he continued his career as an attorney, including many slave cases. And that meant he was here in 1847, which was a pretty big year for Marshall. In January of 1847 is when the Crosswhite case started. Adam and Sarah Crosswhite had been slaves on a plantation in Kentucky, and they escaped north with their family. They settled here. At the time they settled here, we believe the African-American population in town was anywhere from 200 to 400 at times, usually right around just over 200. They settled in a little sharecropper cabin about half a block north of where our VFW hall is now. I think they liked it here. They had a lot of friends, but they kept telling people, the slave chasers are coming. And of course, you know they had reason to fear that. The stories they were hearing were horrific. And on a bitter cold January morning in 1847, those fears came true. When a slave chaser came to town With the slave owner's son, they got the sheriff, and they kicked down the door to the Crosswhite cabin. Adam and his oldest son immediately ran for help. And soon there was a mob out in front of that cabin. And no doubt the bulk of them were African American, but I'm pleased to say some of them European Americans, the whites were there too. I'd like to say they took a stand there and then against slavery. I don't know that they did. But I do know they took a stand, and a pretty strong one, against something like this happening in their town. We know what happened because we have the handwritten affidavits. We know that David Gilner, the son of that plantation owner, sat at a table in the Crosswhite cabin and cried when Sarah said she wouldn't go back. Said, fine, you and Adam can go, just give me your children. He seemed surprised when she said, no. The citizens of Marshall prevented the Crosswhites from being taken that day. But as the slave chaser was leaving, he said, this is illegal. Give me your names. This is what I'm proud of the citizens for. You see, they gave their names. Some of them even spelled their name to make sure he got it right. And then they sent him off to the Justice of Peace, because after all, he kicked down the door to a cabin. And friends helped the Crosswhites out. They eventually got them to Jackson, and from there they got to Detroit, through the Congregational Church of Detroit, and from there to safety in Canada, where they settled near Buxton, as so many former slaves did. But the slave chaser was right. And of course, it was illegal to prevent the slaves from being taken back. So the citizens of Marshall found themselves in federal court in Detroit. Now this trial ended in a hung jury, but the slave owner tried again. This time there seemed to be less people listed on it. They were no doubt going for money. There seemed to be more whites and less African Americans on it. In the following spring, they were back in federal court in Detroit. Big trial, covered in newspapers all across the nation and beyond. And those citizens were found guilty. I always say guilt and innocent. It was actually a civil trial, but they were found guilty and fined thousands of dollars. Thousands of dollars. This by now 1848. It's a lot of money. They didn't actually have to pay that fine because the gentleman in Detroit wanted to make a point of this. Zachariah, I always get his name wrong. Do you remember?
Chandler.
There, thank you very much. Wanted to make a political point about this, so he actually paid that fine. I always struggle trying to emphasize how big of a case it was. As I said, I would like to think the citizens of Marshall were trying to make a point about slavery. I don't know, maybe they were just trying to make a political point. Whatever it was, it had legs. It was a big case. You see, it's known in the courts as Giltner versus Gorham. Giltner being the slave owner, Gorham being a young businessman here in town, a young banker would have no doubt continued his career. But due to the notoriety of this case, he went on to be the U.S. ambassador to The Hague, the Netherlands. Fine post to get even today. The prosecuting attorney in this case, he went on to be the U.S. counsel to the Sandwich Islands, later known as the Hawaiian Islands. He came back and he built the Honolulu house here in town. Came back kind of in disgrace. Bit of a financial muck-up out there. Hey, that's okay, he was loony. He liked the Polynesian lifestyle so much that he wore white linen suits. Unfortunately, he was a Supreme Court justice and had to ride by horseback to Lansing. He soon died of pneumonia. Now, the prosecuting attorney in this case, well, he went on, that would be our own, well, no, he wasn't the prosecuting attorney. He was friends with the prosecuting attorney and he worked on the side of the defense, and that would be our own James J. Gordon. And in 1850, he was asked to be the U.S. counsel to Brazil, and he agreed. He was there for 3 years until word came back in December of 1853 that he had died falling off a balcony. There's some speculation there. You see his predecessor also died falling off a balcony. And the same person benefited both times. We don't know where he's buried, so if you're ever in Brazil, look him up. Let me know. Now, his wife Mary retained ownership of this house, though, and she lived here until the 1880s. She sold it then so she could move in with her adult daughter out of state, but she liked Marshall. She came back, and she's buried at the cemetery right up the street. This is the same cemetery where you'll find Adam Crosswhite. I think the Crosswhites liked Marshall. They came back, and they lived out their lives right here. Sarah didn't make it back, but Ben was here for years before he moved to Battle Creek, and he's buried over there. Now I do have to go back to 1847 though, because something else happened in this to shatter our hopes and dreams in this town. I don't know if you heard, but it was time for the legislator in America, or in Michigan, to decide where the capital was going to be, and we didn't get that. In their infinite wisdom, they put it in a place called Red Cedar Fishing Village that had 8 registered voters. A bit of a political slap in the face. They soon renamed it Lansing, and that became the capital we know today. We're not resentful at all. Really. Now this house was in private hands until the 1960s, at which point a woman was living in just one room of the house. The rest was in great disrepair. When the woman who was here died, the descendants asked if there was a nonprofit in town who'd like to take it over, and the Mary Marshall chapter DAR agreed, and we've had it ever since. We have nothing from James Ray Gordon. I wish we did. We don't. Indeed, we have very little that we could salvage from the house when we got it. What we have is a house that was built with all the passion and belief of that capital era. And then just like the homes that so many people come to Marshall to tour, it was simply lived in ever since. And that's what we invite people in to experience. Almost everything you see has been generously donated over the past almost 50 years that we've had it. Everything's been donated. We are extraordinarily grateful. We love history. We research all the time. One of our greatest experiences was meeting Marshal and learning more and more about our own governor that had this house. You do get to go throughout the house. If you have any questions at all, let me know. I'd be more than happy to tell you more. Is there anything else you'd like me to touch on?
No, we're going to do a quick sit with Sarah crossway piece.
Awesome. Awesome.
And then maybe we can send people off into the house.
In different areas?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. This is probably the biggest room.